The report says several Irish Catholic religious orders covered up 6 decades of brutality and molestation of boys and girls assigned to their care in special cares, reformatories and orphanages. It says Catholic priests and nuns terrorised thousands of children in workhouse-style schools beginning in the 1930s, and the government did little to stop the chronic beatings, rapes and other abuse. So clearly a damning report there. Well, to discuss this with me more is Colm O'Gorman. He was abused from the age of 14 to 16 by a priest and has written a book about his experience, Beyond Belief. Colm, thanks very much for being with us. We'll talk a little bit about your experiences in a moment, but first of all, you've had sight of some of this report. Give us a sense of what can be found there. It really is shocking. It's
a very, very lengthy report. It runs to about 5 volumes and it's just gone live online, so I've had a quick scan of it. I mean, what the report has found is a regime of physical and emotional abuse that was delivered in a severe and regimented manner. It describes what it saw as a response to a 19th century response to a social problem that was never updated. It found that physical abuse was severe and systemic across all homes, that in boys' home in particular, ritualised beatings were the norm, and that physical abuse was a means of communication with children. It was the norm. And that it wasn't the act of individuals, as it was too widespread, that it was the response of a system to children who were placed in their care. It found that sexual abuse was chronic, particularly across boys' homes. With regard to the state, it found something that I think many of us have been saying for some time, that the Irish state was entirely deferential to religious orders and abdicated their responsibility for children to a very significant degree. The state stood back, stepped to one side and said it had nothing to do with us. And where that kind of void is created, and any institution, particularly a human institution, is given unaccountable and unquestioned authority over the care of what are very marginalised and vulnerable people, these are the kind of appalling violations that sadly we always see.
It's taken 9 years to get to this stage, and the people running the inquiry have spoken to literally thousands of children. As you say, it creates a picture of what had become a whole culture. This was 60 years' worth of abuse, which was so widespread. What do you put that down to?
A system. I mean, it was a systemic response to what initially may have been seen as a social problem. But what we had was the development of a system that needed to perpetuate itself. At one point, the report tells us that there were as many children in institutional care in the Republic of Ireland, when the population was about 3.5 million, as there were at the same time in the United Kingdom, where the population was 50 million. Institutions were paid a capitation grant, a per-head payment for children in their care. And I actually think that the finance aspect of this report, which I haven't had an opportunity to examine in any great detail, is very, very, very significant. The Commission, which is a judicial inquiry, these are findings of a judicial process, found that funding was adequate, but they did not find in any one school the care provision to have been adequate, albeit that to varying degrees. They found that funding was very significant, huge, in a time when there was very limited funding available. The state was not funding services, and yet huge funding was made available to congregations. There's one really disturbing example of how that funding might have been used. The Artane Boys' Home, an institution run by the Christian Brothers, who unfortunately have delivered the same kind of tragic institutionalised regime in many countries, Canada and Australia in particular. But in Artane, money was used to support a vast congregations, with brothers living what could only be described as the high life. The kitchen in Artane for the boys, which catered for between 700 and 800 boys, was staffed by one elderly brother and some boys who worked in the kitchen. The kitchen for the brothers, and there were 24 brothers living in the home, was staffed by 2 trained cooks, maids, and boys who served the brothers in the institution. So huge resources relative to the time were available. Those resources were not used to care for children. They were used to support an institution that was more interested in itself than any kind of care at all. It's a deeply, deeply, deeply distressing report to even begin to look at.
You were abused by your parish priest, and it's something that you have taken what is a very bold step to speak out about. Presumably a lot of those people, and we were hearing earlier from our correspondent, moved away from Ireland and couldn't bear to be in their home country anymore, and are still living with secrets, presumably, and things that have changed the course of their life.
About 30,000 people went through these institutions over the period dealt with within this report. About 2,500 individual complaints were received by the Commission. So, without a doubt, there are many, many thousands of adults who haven't survived, who are no longer with us, who will have died as a consequence of how they were treated. There's no doubt about that. But there are many, many thousands who haven't been able to speak, who haven't been able to speak out and seek support, and they are living, quite frankly, damaged, difficult lives as a result. And we have now, I think, a responsibility to examine how we properly support those adults still living at the consequences. But also we need to recognise there's a multi-generational impact of this kind of barbarity and cruelty. That right down to generations, if we so devastate people's capacity to live healthy lives, lives where they can love and have loving, real relationships, that has an impact in their later lives. There are social problems in Ireland today that are directly, I believe, accountable to this kind of brutality and depravity, and we need to confront that. Equally, we need to make sure that in how we care for Ireland currently, we place children, their needs, their rights and their dignity at the heart of any decision-making process about their welfare, about their futures. We've yet to do that, and we've a long way to go. In my own case, I was raped and abused by a Roman Catholic priest over a 2.5-year period when I was 14 years of age. In 1995, I decided that I needed to report that, and I reported it to the Irish police. I was stunned to discover over the next 2 years that not only had I not been alone in that experience, that the same priest had abused very many other children, but that the church had known about him before they ever even ordained him. So they had received numerous complaints right across his career as a priest. They had done nothing about it. They had covered it up. They had facilitated. They had colluded. Not in a passive way, but in an active way. And as I began to dig deeper, I realised that this wasn't a pattern that was unique to the diocese that I grew up in, or unique to my country. It was an institutional, systemic issue for the global Catholic Church, which was why, ultimately, I decided that the way to go was to sue the Pope, and I launched a civil action against the Pope in 1998. I succeeded in my legal case against the church, where I received an admission of negligence and a payment of damages and an acceptance of what had happened. The Pope dodged responsibility by using diplomatic immunity to avoid answering questions about what he knew or what the institution knew. So we've a long way to go before we properly hold institutions like the Catholic Church to account. And I don't mean in a vengeful way. I think if we're serious about caring for vulnerable people, if we're serious about putting ourselves in a position of that kind of authority or power, we need to be accountable. And the Church is not unique in that regard. It needs to be accountable.
OK, Colin O'Gorman, thank you very much.